My name is Alicia Albrechtsen from Pneumatic Addict, and I am going to teach you everything you need to know about primers.
This video is brought to you by our apparel and footwear sponsor, Timberland Pro. Timberland Pro supports me as a maker and has challenged me to share my favorite tips and tricks that I've learned over the years.
Question number 1. What is a primer? A primer is a base coat which is applied to the surface before a paint or finish. Its job is to promote adhesion of your finish to your substrate, which makes your finish both look better and last longer. A primer can also be used to seal the material that you're finishing to prevent things like liquid and smoke from either penetrating into the material or coming out of it. For example, helping to make masonry watertight or sealing old wood so you don't get tannin or smoke smell coming up through the surface. What kind of primers are out there and how do I know which one I need? When we're talking about household primers, the type that you will typically use on DIY projects, there are 3 main categories: water-based, oil-based, and alcohol, more realistically shellac-based primers. Each primer base has its own pros and cons, but typically the best advice is to use the same base primer as the finish that you're going to follow up with. Meaning, if I'm going to be applying a water-based latex paint, I want to start with a water-based primer. There's one exception, which I will get to in just a few minutes. Oil-based are some of the oldest primers out there. They've been sold for generations, and there's a reason why you still see them on the shelf. Oil-based primers have great adhesion and are especially hard-wearing. Typically, they're also the best kind of primer to prevent mold, mildew, and moisture from transferring through a surface. The downsides of using an oil-based primer are the fact that they typically dry slowly, they have higher VOCs or volatile organic compounds, which means they're not as environmentally friendly, and I highly recommend you wear a respirator when using them. And the biggest problem about oil-based primers is they're not compatible with a whole range of modern finishes, especially water-based. Just like we all learned when we were kids, oil and water don't like to mix. So typically you're going to be unable to apply a water-based finish on top of an oil-based primer. Nowadays, a lot of manufacturers are moving away from solvent-based finishes and producing a lot more waterborne finishes and paints. Often, water-based products are more environmentally friendly and a little bit safer for the DIYer to use. Some of the upsides of using a water-based primer are the fact that it dries really fast, especially if you live in a dry climate. Water-based primers are probably the easiest to clean up because they typically only require soap and water. Water-based primers are also really easy to find, so you'll have no problem finding them at any sort of big box or home improvement store. Now, to address the downsides of water-based primer, just like we mentioned before, water and oil don't mix. So if you plan on applying a solvent or oil-based finish, like spray paint maybe, you're not going to have great adhesion. And the final downside of water-based primers is the fact that they dry so quickly. Slower drying products require patience, which is annoying, but that extra drying time typically allows the product to settle a little bit so you don't see brush strokes or roller marks as easily. The third most common type of primer you're going to see is a shellac-based primer. Just a little secret, shellac-based primers are actually my favorite. I'm going to go more into detail about why shellac primers are my favorite further along in the video. But in the meantime, here are a few of the benefits of using a shellac-based primer. Like water-based finishes, shellac dries very quickly. In fact, a little faster than water-based finishes, which makes it easy to prime and finish a project all in one day. Unlike oil or water-based primers, shellac is actually compatible with almost every type of finish. Shellac is also really good at sealing a substrate, which makes it better for covering stains and sealing in moisture and smells. One of the downsides of a shellac-based primer is the fact that it typically needs to be cleaned up using denatured alcohol. I've also noticed that shellac-based primers can be a little bit more expensive than maybe a water-based primer. And similar to water-based primer, because shellac primers dry so quickly, sometimes you need a little bit more experience to get a perfectly smooth and level finish. Next question, when do I need to use a primer? A primer is almost always required when you're finishing either a super porous surface, like fresh drywall or masonry, or on the other end, a highly polished and smooth surface, like glass or plastic. In the case of porous materials, applying a primer is going to help seal all those tiny microscopic openings in the substrate. The primer is going to prevent that substrate that you're applying it to from soaking up finish unevenly, creating blotchiness. When you're working with a porous surface, you might be tempted to think, I don't need a primer. I'll just apply a few extra coats of paint. Occasionally that works, but something good to keep in mind is typically primers are a lot less expensive than paint and finish. So actually applying a coat or two of primer before your paint or finish can sometimes save you money. Another question I've been asked a lot is, if I'm going to be applying a primer, does that mean I still need to sand? The answer on this one is sometimes. If you're using an extra sticky bonding primer, especially something that's designed to work with difficult materials like plastic, you might get away with not having to sand your material before. Those type of primers sometimes actually dissolve a microscopic layer of the substrate you're applying it to, so it chemically bonds the two together. Sanding's a bit of a different situation when it comes to those really smooth and shiny surfaces. Everybody's wanting to save time, and most people hate sanding. Primers have come a long way, but in my experience, I still recommend you do a little bit of light sanding for most jobs. Just even a little bit of light sanding on the substrate that you're going to cover helps give the surface what we call tooth, or basically just enough porosity for that primer and product to grab onto and be resistant to flaking and peeling once that film finish is fully cured. If you absolutely hate sanding and you're going to avoid sandpaper at all costs, in some cases you have the option to use a product which is called a deglosser. Deglossers work by very lightly etching the surface of glossy materials. This light etching has the same effect as adding some tooth by lightly sanding. Deglossers don't work on every surface, so I highly recommend you do a small sample section before you move forward with your whole project. If the goal of finishing your substrate or the project that you're working on is to prevent moisture or odors from coming in or out, then you're pretty much always going to need to sand and prime. Final question, why are shellac-based primers my favorite? Shellac is pretty cool stuff, and it's been around for thousands of years. Traditional shellac is made out of two things, an organic resin and denatured alcohol. Shellac in its pure form is actually non-toxic. Believe it or not, it's sometimes applied to the surface of food like candy to get that really pretty glossy shine. Okay, this part's gonna get a little gross for just a second. I'm gonna tell you where the shellac resin comes from. Shellac resin is actually a secretion from the rear end of a special kind of beetle. Basically, it's bug goo. Once the bug goo is fully dried, it can be chipped off the tree, purified, and eventually turned into the type of shellac we use as a finish today. Makes you think a little differently about those glossy jelly beans at Easter, huh? Shellac is considered a universal finish, which means it's a very rare product that can be used with both oil-based and water-based finishes. So after your shellac or shellac-based primer is fully dry, you can follow up with either water-based or oil-based paint or finish. As somebody who builds a lot with wood, the second reason why I love using shellac as a base coat is the fact that unlike water and water-based finishes, shellac and denatured alcohol don't cause the grain of wood to swell. Have you ever sprayed water-based primer or paint on a piece of raw wood and then come back once it's dry and it feels super rough and spiky? This is because the water in your finish soaked into the grain of the wood, causing the fibers to swell. And when they swell, they push up against each other, and you always get a few fibers that end up standing up. When this happens, if you want to get a smooth and even finish, your only option is to follow up with some light sanding to knock that grain back down. If you're building something really large or intricate, that extra step can take hours and be very tedious. In recent years, I've started applying a layer of shellac or shellac-based primer before I'm going to be using a water-based finish. I like to use what's called a sanding sealer, or basically a thinned out version of shellac, even if I'm going to be applying a clear coat to my surface. The shellac dries super fast, and I'm still able to use those modern water-based finishes that I love. I'm one of those weirdos who actually really enjoys the finishing process of a DIY project. I filmed a few different videos in the past which share some of my finishing experience. I'll leave links to those down in the box below. In full disclosure, some of those I filmed long time ago, back when I was a baby YouTuber, so just be gentle with the cinematography. Now I want to hear from you. What types of primers have you used on your projects, and how have they worked out for you?
If you're looking for the perfect gear to outfit yourself with during your next finishing project, check out Timberland Pro. I'll leave links to what I wear in the description box below.
If you want to learn a little bit more about how to get professional results when you're finishing your project, check out this video. And if you like other types of DIY content, check out this video as well. And as always, thanks for watching, guys.